Today is Thursday, April 9th, 2020, and we are 3 days away from Easter. And traditionally, the Thursday before Easter is the day that Christians believe Jesus had his Last Supper or celebrated the Passover with his disciples. It's also April 2020, and we're in the midst of a shelter-at-home COVID-19 situation. And putting those two thoughts together, I thought I might share a idea that came from a book I read by Paul Brand titled In the Likeness of God. And maybe to understand the story, I should back up just a little bit. I'm not a medical doctor, but here's what I understand in terms of how a virus or bacteria infects a person. When a virus or bacteria invades, our blood responds by sending out defenders. And the initial wave of defense is kind of like a kamikaze attack, where it seeks to, slow down the progress of the virus or the bacteria. But it won't eventually overcome the virus or the bacteria, it just slows it down. And then it becomes a battle of time, whether or not the bacteria or the virus will overcome the body, or whether or not the blood will figure out a way to create antibodies which are able to destroy the virus or the bacteria. So it's a race against time. For many thousands of years, viruses have caused epidemics and pandemics in the world. And one particular virus, the smallpox, ravaged the world for many thousands of years. There's evidence of the smallpox even in Egyptian mummies. And many historians believe that the Aztec and Inca civilizations were largely decimated by the smallpox virus. So today, though, we don't really deal much with the smallpox. It's been eradicated. And largely that's due to a thing called vaccination. So how did that come about? And that's a story that Paul Brand tells. A doctor by the name of Edward Jenner, Christian man, developed the idea that if a person is exposed to cowpox, which is a slightly less deadly form of virus, that their blood would learn by learning how to defeat the cowpox, would also learn how to defeat the smallpox. Their antibody that would be created in the defeat of the cowpox would be useful in defeating the smallpox. So Edward Jenner began to vaccinate by exposing people to the cowpox, and then in turn they were then inoculated against the more deadly smallpox disease. One of the fun stories with this that has some significance for me was that the Spanish colony in Bogota, Colombia, was being ravaged by the smallpox. And in 1802, they sent word to Spanish King Charles IV requesting help with the smallpox. And he sent an expedition of a doctor and 22 orphaned boys with the intent, because the problem with the cowpox vaccination was that it wouldn't last very long. You couldn't take it from England or from Europe and all the way over to South America. So the idea was that they would infect 2 boys at a time, and after each boy had contracted the disease, and they would take from them some of the infected material and infect 2 more boys, and by that method transfer the vaccination across the ocean to Atlantic. And basically they get to Venezuela with the last boy being infected, and then from there they're able to infect others and save the entire population of Bogota, Colombia, as well as Peru and Argentina and Mexico, and even on into the Philippines. The vaccination process was continued. And I happen to have adopted 2 children from Bogota, Colombia, and so I guess I wonder a little bit, if that Edward Jenner hadn't found that vaccination and King Charles hadn't have done the expedition, whether or not they would even be alive. The other reason why I think this is interesting is because of its tie-in with communion. We read in Matthew chapter 26 at the Lord's Supper, it says, "Then he took the cup, gave thanks, and offered it to them, saying, 'Drink from it, all of you. This is my blood of the new covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins.'" Somehow the illustration here with the Lord's Supper is that Christ's blood takes away our sins. And using the analogy with the smallpox, each of us has a spiritual disease called sin. And yet, the difference is that no matter how much time we have, we will not be able to develop the antibodies to defeat sin. We need somebody's blood who has defeated sin and its result, death. And that's why Easter is so fascinating to me, and why the symbolism of the Lord's Supper is so fascinating to me, because with the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ, He defeats sin and death in His blood. And in a sense, when we participate in the Lord's Supper, we are sharing in the blood that also can defeat sin and death. 1 Corinthians 15 says, the sting of sin is death, and the power of sin is the law. But thanks be to God, He gives us the victory through Jesus Christ. And I also think the communion is interesting in that Old Testament wise, when you were trying to remove sin, animal sacrifice was the method. People would kill an animal, and then they would take the blood typically and sprinkle it on themselves or on things. But we know that blood, because animals hadn't defeated sin, was only a temporary remedy, and that ultimately the sacrifice and the blood of animals didn't remove sin from us. But Christ's blood, which we illustratively, symbolically, in Lord's Supper actually take into ourselves, because He did defeat sin and death, it is able to defeat sin and death in us. He was tempted in every way just as we are, and yet was without sin. I like the song, So Will I, 1,000, 100 billion times, where he says in that song, if Christ will leave the grave behind, so will I. And that's the whole message of Easter, that Christ has defeated sin and death in His blood, and that He has allowed us to share in that, participated in that, by believing in Him and celebrating the resurrection. So I just want to encourage you this Easter, in the midst of COVID-19, to recognize that Christ has defeated the most important virus in our lives, so to speak, the virus of sin and death, and that we can celebrate that and be thankful for that victory through Him.